a two-parter today, and we are going to start talking about the brains and bodies of students with trauma and just people in general. So hi, I'm Bailey Colley. You guys know me. I'm your tiered intervention specialist. So excited for you guys all to be here. I really appreciate it. This is what the first part of our training is going to talk about. We're going to talk about the brain, just some overviews of it. We'll go into the actual brain development, including teenage brains, which are really interesting and very confusing. Then we'll talk about trauma's impact, and then we're going to touch on the Polyvagal Theory before we go into the next one. All right, so let's dig into the brain, one of my favorite things to talk about. So we have three major parts of our brain that we're going to be talking about. The first part is our brain stem. This is actually our reptilian brain and is the first thing to develop and is the only fully developed part of our brain when we're born. This is our survival brain that's really only concern is asking the question, am I safe? And its language is your bodily sensations. So it takes what your body is telling you and to determine if you're safe or not safe. These are our automatic functions, so things like our breathing, heart rate, body temperature, that is all controlled by the brainstem. It is also instinctive and reflexive. So this is like our primal brain, and things just happen without us even being able to know that something is happening.
Middle schoolers are only controlled by that part.
Not quite. The next part we'll get to. Yes. So again, this is the only part of our brain that's fully developed when we're born, and it just kind of is in charge of making us regulated, keeping us at homeostasis and safe. Next, we have our emotional brain. This is our limbic system. This is also known as like the midbrain. It was developed with mammals as they evolved. So our emotional brain asks the question, am I loved? And its language is feelings and emotions. So here, this is kind of our command center for coping with challenges. This is also where we control and express our emotions. And it is the location of our amygdala and hippocampus, which I'm going to dig a little deeper into. So first we have our amygdala, which again is part of the limbic system. So this is kind of like our prairie dog, if you want to think of it as an animal. It's like our prairie dog. It is our alarm system. It's just looking out. It's looking around for threats. That's its only job. So it's just scanning the environment constantly. And then if a threat is sensed, your amygdala starts activating. And it starts pumping cortisol and adrenaline into the body, which starts to stimulate fight-flight. So when it starts releasing this cortisol and adrenaline and the alarm system starts going off, this is now where everything is going to stop. So we can only actually use when we're in a fight, flight, and a fear state, we only have access to that amygdala, a little bit of our limbic system, and our brainstem. When we freak out here, we don't have access to our prefrontal cortex, to those higher brain functions. So oftentimes we're like, this kid's freaking out, but they're not listening to me. Why aren't they just behaving? Because they don't actually have access to that part of the brain. So it's not a choice. It is an automatic function. If you detect a threat, your alarm bells start going. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up, and your breathing increases. And with these high levels of cortisol and adrenaline pumping, it is very, very difficult to reason or use any logical thought because that part of your brain is inaccessible. This is also what deals with self-control. So when you think it's starting to freak out, because the fear center, so when our kids are freaking out, their self-control is like off the map. That's what they're struggling with. The other really important part of the limbic system when it comes to students of trauma is their hippocampus. So the hippocampus is where our memories are. It is kind of like our mental sticky notes and our hard drive, like our filing system, is that hippocampus. And that is what holds all of our prior knowledge and helps us make connections between experiences. So when we're using our hippocampus and everything's fine and we're able to use our brain correctly because we're not in a stress state, we are able to use that hippocampus correctly. We're able to encode information. We're able to store things into our long-term memory. We're able to use prior knowledge from past experiences. However, when you are in a state of stress or a stress response, it starts to mess up how your brain is going to encode information and recall information. Because that amygdala we had just talked about, that is actually the connection between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex that we're talking about next. So when that amygdala goes offline, it severs the connection between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So when our kids are in crisis and freaking out, and we're like, why aren't they using, don't they remember last time? No, they don't, because they can't remember it because that part has been severed with that access. This is also where we process emotions and have working memory. Most of our executive functions are all in the prefrontal cortex, except for our working memory is actually in the hippocampus, which I think is pretty interesting. So I've been talking a whole lot about our big thinking brain. This is our prefrontal cortex. So this is the thinking brain. This is the last part of the brain to develop and actually is not fully developed until about age 25, 26. So like your brain's still not fully developed. Which is one reason why it always cracks me up to give this lecture to grad school students, because I'm like, all right, your brains are still developing. So if you want to do something to change a habit, start now, when your brain's still really malleable. So when we're here, we're asking the question, what can I learn? And our language here is actual language, because this is the part of the brain that we need to be in to understand language. And again, it's the last to develop, and this is where we have abstract thought. It governs our thinking, language, processing, problem solving, and learning. So this is where the primary executive functions are. This is where we have our planning, how we can focus our attention, problem solving, verbal reasoning, able to use self-control, mental flexibility, multitasking, initiating tasks. This is where we need to be to learn. If we want our kids to be learning what we're teaching them and we're not just wasting our breath, we need them in their prefrontal cortex. Because neuroscience tells us that if they're not here, you can be teaching the best, most engaging lesson of your life and it's not going to stick. They're just not going to hear it because their brain is not primed in the place to learn. And remember how I said when that amygdala starts to freak out, it severs this connection. So this totally just goes offline during a stress response. So when we start seeing a student exhibiting those pain-based behaviors that we see as defiant, it's actually they're actually reacting to their environment and triggers, and it's their brain doing it. It's not them being a butthead, basically. So that is one of the biggest things I think is important to know, is that when our kids are in a stress response, or when we are in a stress response and we're triggered by our students, we're not here. And we want to be here to be able to teach. Because I'm sure we all know how much of a pain in the behind it is to teach when you're dysregulated and annoyed at your students. Because they're not doing what you want. And it is very hard to give up that control as a teacher. So now we're going to dig a little into the actual brain development. So our brains develop from the bottom up and from the middle out. So like we talked about how the brainstem develops first, and then we start to develop that limbic system. And then as that gets more mature, then we start processing and getting that prefrontal cortex going. It's also experience dependent. So often we think like, oh, well, that kid should just know better. Have they had the experience to teach them to know better? Because every experience we have actually changes the functioning of our brain, positive or negative. It will change how your synapses actually fire, especially in those early life experiences. If you have a student who was not strongly connected to their caregiver, does not have any strong memories of feeling actually loved by their parents, those circuits in the brain for kindness and empathy can just not develop. So simply put, they don't actually have the brain neurological capacity to be kind because they've never learned it, because they've never felt it. So how can we help them feel that? Because kindness and empathy are teachable skills. They are definitely teachable skills. So we always have to remember, it's not what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them. What happened to make their brains like this? Because our brains are shaped to survive in our families, which could be a good or a bad thing. Also, our greatest time of neurological growth is when we are in utero until about 2 years old. That is when the synapses are just going crazy and your brain is just exploding with stuff going on. This is the greatest time of the brain maturing. Also, our nervous system will develop at the same time as the brain. So we'll talk about the nervous system in a little bit. They form together. So when there's an issue with the brain, there's often an issue with the nervous system. And when they're in the womb, trauma can impact them. If mom is experiencing a lot of stress while she's pregnant, that baby's brain is going to come out differently than a mother who just had an average amount of stress. So if that mother, what'd you say? A healthy amount of stress, not toxic stress. So when the mother is experiencing a trauma or experiencing toxic stress, it actually changes that baby's brain development and the gene expression. Now let's get into my favorite part of the brain to talk about. The teenagers. Because we all know how regulated and calm and controlled our teenagers are, right? So I said how in utero to 2 years old was the greatest time of change and growth in the brain. Well, the teenage years is the second time of the greatest growth and change. From age 12 to your mid-20s, your brain is just changing constantly. It is reorganizing and new synapses are being created. And it turns out with our teenagers, it's not actually the hormones making them crazy, it's the changing brains. It is all the stuff going on inside their head that they can't quite figure out, and that's what they are dealing with, is their brains are actually changing while they're sitting in our classrooms. So the brain, not the hormones, are responsible for thoughts and behaviors of our teenagers when they make all those really good choices. Middle school is actually where the brain is changing the most. 7th grade especially. Middle school is when it is changing the most. So that's why, when I was in the classroom, I taught middle school, and I tried to instill as much I could with how we can grow synapses in the brain, things like using mindfulness and self-regulation strategies, grounding techniques to help make their brains more effective. Because this is also a time where it's the rapid neural development, their brains are malleable, but this is when we can restore any of the impacts from trauma as they are from their early childhood. Their brains are changing so much now that this is the time that we can change their brains and help mitigate those effects from early childhood trauma. Which is why secondary can be so crucial in really forming how those brains are going to change and which road these kids are going to go down. So 2 big things happen during this time of reorganization, and that is myelination and synaptic pruning. So myelination is when we just have a bunch of neurons going through our head. When a neuron gets something called a myelin sheath wrapped around it that gets created, that nerve is getting myelinated. And that myelin sheath makes everything really quick and really organized. So if that nerve has a myelin sheath around it, it's going to be almost instant. It is going to be very fast and very organized. So the more an adolescent actually does certain behaviors, the more those behaviors become habits. And those neural pathways become stronger due to those pathways are the ones that are getting myelinated. So we have a kid engaging in a bunch of really poor behaviors over and over and over and over and over again. That's the pattern that's going to be stuck in their brain. And it's going to be way harder to change it once they get out of our system. Because what they do now shapes their adult brains. The other thing I mentioned was something called synaptic pruning. And that is when we're kids, we have so many, our imagination is huge. There's so many possibilities because we just have like a bunch of neurons just going. This is when we start to lose them. Our imagination kind of goes away at this point. We no longer see just unlimited possibilities. Because when we're not using these synapses, they just go away. They straight up go away. So it is going to create a specialized differentiated network. And our adolescents of trauma already have neuroinflammation in their brains, like their brain is kind of inflamed, which increases a risk for mood disorder and poor executive functioning. And this pruning actually increases the risk for mental illnesses. It increases children's stress reactivity, their sensitivity to drugs, and reduction in gray matter. Gray matter and white matter in the brain, I'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about how trauma impacts it. That is where our abstract thinking, that is our fluid reasoning. And students of trauma have less gray matter in their brain. Also, as we talked about, their prefrontal cortex is not formed, because it's not formed until you're out of college. So even though their brain is the adult size at age 12, it's not matured. It's not matured at all. And they are also controlled by those limbic systems. So not quite the brainstem, but the limbic system, that emotional brain. So it's the time of emotional instability. And their emotions fluctuate like crazy, as we know, especially those of us who work in the secondary schools. Their emotions are also way more intense and extreme now than at any other time in their life. There is an increase in negative emotions. And then as adults, we use our prefrontal cortex when we're making decisions because we have fully developed brains. But the teenagers are listening to that amygdala, that fear center, that threat detection. So they're listening to their emotions and their instincts, and they're impulsive, which is going to lead to poor decision making and over-the-top emotional responses. Neurotransmitters are really interesting at the time of when teenagers are developing. So there are dramatic changes in that white matter, gray matter, and those neurotransmitters during adolescence. So their neurotransmitters actually react stronger to stressors at this time in their life, so their brain is super excitable. And the brain changes, and changes in the neurotransmitters make them more likely to engage in risky behaviors and make some poor choices. So this is when we see kids start to experiment with drugs, alcohol, and risky sex. We also have the highest levels of testosterone. Not male or female, just highest levels during your life of testosterone is in the teenage years, making them extra impulsive and have increased aggression. We are also at the lowest levels of dopamine and serotonin when they're a teenager. So those are our happy, feel-good neurotransmitters. The lowest level in all of your lifetime will be when you're a teenager. The lowest, when you need it the most, exactly. They have such low levels of serotonin and dopamine. But when dopamine is released during adolescence, it is more extreme and euphoric than at any other time in your life. So when they feel good, they feel really, really good, which is also one reason why when they start experimenting with things like drugs and alcohol, it feels really, really, really good right now. So they're going to keep trying to chase that feeling really, really good, because their brains do not feel really, really good normally. Any questions or clarification before I move to our next spot? Okay. All right, now let's talk about trauma. Why I'm here, why you guys are here. So I know you've heard me say trauma will impact the brain. Any study you read is going to say trauma negatively impacts brain structure and development. Well, it actually does. If you look at the two brains on the board right now, this is a normal 3-year-old. Normal 3-year-old. This is a 3-year-old child who was in a Romanian orphanage and had lack of sensory stimulation, lack of adult connection. Look at that, how that brain worked when it was stimulated. Same age. One brain had a typical childhood. One had one living in chronic stress and adversity. You can see it. Their brains are different. So trauma negatively impacts all parts of our brain, especially our neocortex and that prefrontal cortex and all of our executive functions. So everything we need kids to do to be successful in school, it's way harder for these kids because their brains don't develop the same way. And also, people of trauma have less gray matter and white matter in our brains, which is used for that higher order thinking and rational thought and abstract thought. They have less of it. A quote I really like is that trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and body manage perceptions. Because their world is going to look different than this kid's world. And their brains also get inflamed, so they start to get a bit swollen, which makes them at a much higher risk for developing mood disorders and having mental health struggles. As you can see, there are actual structural differences. Like, you can see differences in these brains just by looking at them. And that is because people with complex trauma have structural changes to the prefrontal cortex, limbic system, cerebellum, and corpus callosum. I'm going to explain what those are, don't worry. So their prefrontal cortex, that thinking brain where we need them to be, if we want them to learn, if we want them to pass our tests, that's where they need to be when we're teaching them. It is not as interconnected as those who didn't have childhood trauma. So they don't have as many connections. Their brain's not firing as quickly. Their prefrontal cortex also shrinks. So it is physically smaller than children without trauma. They also have a lot of dysfunction in their hippocampus and amygdala. Because as the body is exposed to prolonged levels of stress hormones, when that adrenaline and cortisol keeps pumping, our hippocampus actually gets smaller in people of trauma. They have a smaller hippocampus in size and volume. But people of trauma's amygdalas are bigger. They are actually overactive and much larger in people of trauma, which is why they can be triggered way quicker than people without it. Because that amygdala is overactive and is just ready to go. And it is, that cortisol and adrenaline just inflames the brain and just makes them just ready. I also mentioned the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is a very, very important part of our brain. It is kind of like the bridge. It's what connects our two brain hemispheres. Because the hemispheres do different things. For example, our right brain is our emotional brain, and our left brain is our language, rational brain. So if that corpus callosum is not strong, it makes it really difficult to talk between those two hemispheres. So it is really hard for them to put those emotions into words because they would have to cross that corpus callosum to get to it. There is a way to help build and strengthen those corpus callosums, though, and that is doing any sort of movement where you cross the midline. So it's really easy in elementary and primary world because they'll do silly dances with you, and you can make them do all the things you want to do. In the secondary level, we would try and pair up words like our vocab words with movements of the body and make them do something obnoxious where they're going to cross that midline. So the midline is just if you were to draw a line straight down. If you cross that with your body, it will help strengthen that corpus callosum. I used to keep bean bags in my office when I was in the classroom, and if the kids were just starting to get a little agitated, I would take a small group out in the hallway, and we'd take the bean bag and we just pass it back and forth. And then you go, oh, let's try under the leg. Just make them cross the midline as much as possible. And then it would be really funny when you're like, okay, now throw it to your partner, but it has to go like across. And then you just see beanbags flying everywhere. And the kids think it's hilarious, but we're strengthening that brain. We are strengthening that corpus callosum. So all of these changes, the structural differences in these brains, lead to problems in learning, behavior, and physical health. So because our traumatized children are stuck in fear mode as they grow up, they're kind of living in that stress response. They're living in that chronic stress. So they are hypervigilant to signs of danger, which reduces their ability to filter out irrelevant sensory things. So like if we're in the classroom and we're just teaching, we think everything's fine, but maybe there's like at ES, oh my gosh, someone's on the roof tapping or sawing or something. They can't block that out. They have a much more difficult time blocking that out than other students. So this means that that child's sensory system will often get overloaded. And this is also sometimes when we see a misdiagnosis of autism for students who have actually experienced chronic stress and adversity because of the sensory issues, because their sensory needs are not being met and they don't know how to meet them. They don't know how to regulate themselves. So they will either over-respond or under-respond because their brains can't find that middle ground. We also need to remember that experiences build brains. I mentioned that before about brain development. Every experience you have changes your brain. So we need to be thinking about what experiences they have had and what experiences they haven't had. Like if we're starting a lesson and are going to talk about life on a farm or living in a city or something, you can't just assume that everyone has had those experiences. Like when we're teaching lessons, if it's going to be about something different that we can't assume that they have that experience, we teach it. We make sure that they have that prior knowledge before we start the lesson. Make sure these kids have that prior knowledge. Because you can't just assume that they've learned what they should know by now from their parents. You can't assume that. Relationships are absolutely critical in brain development. We are social organisms. Our brain actually developed for us to be in relationships. The brain cannot function normally if you are not like in some sort of healthy relationship where you can co-regulate with people. Because if these positive relationships are absent, that brain will not develop those circuits needed for kindness and empathy. So we need to teach them how to be with that. So that's why we need to be providing them those experiences of empathy and love and compassion, because they might not be getting them at home. Never assume that a child is getting that at home. One of my favorite quotes, or just a really good quote, is that neuroscience clearly indicates that trauma can have debilitating effects on brain development, resulting in smaller brain size, diminished IQ, antisocial behavior, aggression, and emotional numbness. There's hope, but there's hope because neuroplasticity is a thing, and it remains a thing throughout our entire life. Even now, our brains can be changed if we do work to make this neuroplasticity happen. That basically means your brain is going to change throughout your entire life. Your synapses change. Your neurons change. That's why, I'm 31 now. I'm a very different person than even I was 5 years ago. My brain is functioning in a different way. I think about things differently than I did even 5 years ago. So our brains are just constantly changing, and we can actually help mold our students' brains to create new neural pathways through different brain exercises and just make awareness activities. So things like acts of caring, connection, and love will actually change the brain. And positive relationships will optimize this neuroplasticity and learning. And we do have those critical periods of learning and neuroplasticity, but our brains remain malleable throughout life. So like even if you have a really crappy habit right now, it still can be changed. It just takes us a little longer than if we were teenagers. So our brains can still be changed, but it just takes us a little more work. So trauma doesn't just exist in the brain, it actually lives in our bodies. So the body actually remembers what the mind forgets. So you can have things like, oh, they don't remember that. They were an infant. They were an infant when that happened. How would they remember? That's not going to impact them. No. Because it, as we said, it lives in that nervous system. It changes how your body is going to respond. There is a teacher who had adopted a child of trauma. She adopted the student when they were about 18 months of age. Student mom had overdosed. Dad was like a drug kingpin sort of thing. So the kid had experienced a lot in just those 18 months. Well, this teacher adopted her. She has had a phenomenal life. They love the crap out of her. Has friends, extracurricular activities, does all the like positive upbringing that you think of. But she will still have crazy meltdowns, and they can't get her regulated. Yeah, because when she was an infant, she didn't have a caregiver there to help regulate her. So even though now she has someone, her body is instantly going to go back to that feeling of, I'm so scared, I'm so alone, no one loves me, my body's out of control. Even if she can't consciously think of it, that's what's happening. Something very common that we see with people with trauma histories is that there is a big disconnect to their actual bodies. And then one of like the most famous studies about trauma adversity is the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study done back in the 90s. Basically, long story short, there are 10 adverse childhood experiences that have to do with abuse and household dysfunction. And they were actually doing a study on obesity on adults in California when they stumbled across this. So they had figured out that as the ACE number increases, so do your health problems as an adult. And if you have 4 or more ACEs, you're like, you have like over a 50% chance higher than people without those ACEs to have medical problems in the future, to have a mental health disorder, to have heart disease, to die early, to adopt health risk behaviors. So even if this is happening when they're really young, it impacts them. And I have a YouTube channel, and I have a video all on the ACE study if you want to watch it. It gives a good overview of what it's all about. But yeah, our childhood trauma impacts the diseases we're going to get and if we're going to die early. It can actually tell that by what your childhood adversities were like. Their study found out that because they were looking at obesity in white women, and almost every woman that was obese, they were able to get her to lose a bunch of weight, but then she put it all back on. Turns out, doing therapy, almost every single one of them had sexual abuse as a child. So that was their protection, was gaining all the weight. And then that leads into, heart disease, things like that. So now we are going to talk about the polyvagal theory, which is more about our autonomic nervous system. So before the polyvagal theory, I'll come back to that. Before the polyvagal theory, which was developed in 94 by Dr. Stephen Porges, before that, you were either stressed or not stressed. You were either in rest and digest or in fight flight. That was just it. Stress, not stress, kind of like a light switch. Well, Dr. Porges was like, nah, that's not what's happening. That is not how the brain and body responds to stress. So what actually happens is we got this nerve, our vagus nerve. This is one single nerve. This is just one nerve. It is the longest nerve in our entire body. And is our 10th cranial nerve. So, and it connects that brain stem to all of our major organs. And the cool thing about it is it's bidirectional. So it sends information from the brain down to the organs, and then from the organs up to the brain. So this is what controls our stress responses. So the polyvagal theory is our link between those psychological experiences and physical sensations. And Dr. Porges, instead of saying you're either stressed or not stressed, he's like, no, there are actually 3 states that we exist in and can fluctuate between. And I want to note that we move between these states without any conscious awareness. We don't know when we move between the states, because it's just our vagus nerve is just whoop, instantly we're going to change where we are. So first we have this social engagement system. This is our ventral vagal. This is our happy place. This is our safe space. This is where we can correctly detect environmental cues. This is where we need to be if we want to teach and be able to connect to our students. This is where we want our students to be if we want them to learn and be able to connect with us. This is where we have access to our higher brain functions. We feel safe. We're happy. We can instantly process someone's facial expressions. We can understand their prosody. This is where we also need to be if we want to co-regulate or de-escalate any students. So one hint, when you're super escalated because a kid has just maybe attacked you and you're the one who's supposed to de-escalate him, you can't. You can't. You're not in the brain state to do that. You need to tap out, and someone who is in their social engagement system needs to come in here and do it. Because your brain is not at a place where you can co-regulate and de-escalate that child. You can't. Next, we move into fight-flight. One of the most interesting things I found out about this is before I learned about the polyvagal theory, I just thought, okay, it's fight, flight, and freeze. Like it's just those are our 3 stress responses. Well, no, it's actually fight, flight, and then freeze. They're different. So fight, flight is our sympathetic activation. So this happens when we sense a threat, when we think that we might be in danger, or when that overactive and oversized amygdala tells our kids they're in danger, even if they're not. They're going to go here. This is where we start to get mobilized. We are motivated to get rid of the threat. So like blood starts going to your muscles, your heart rate and breathing increases because you're ready to either fight someone or run away, both of which you need a lot of energy for. So when you're in this state of mobilization, the emotions you have access to are restricted. And then the cortisol and adrenaline will start to flood your system. And when that happens, you lose access to that prefrontal cortex. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a second. So if you can't run away, if you can't fight the threat off, and you're stuck, you go into the 3rd state, the freeze. This is our dorsal vagal shutdown. This is basically like your body is saying, oh my God, there is too much stress. I can't do it anymore. I'm done. It is like, here's your mug, and you just keep pouring the water, and it's starting to overflow. So your dorsal vagal pops a lid on it, and it shuts it down. It just shuts you down. Your body cannot take it anymore. So like, nope, you're done. You're done. So when we start to shut down, we are able to tolerate more pain. We are able to disassociate. So oftentimes students who are stuck in abusive homes, they have to live here because it's easier to just disassociate, get out of your body, than being engaged in the abuse that's happening to you.
I think it's also important to remember that children can go through all of this even if the abuse is not directed towards them.
Oh, yes.
If one parent is abusive to the other, it will impact the children in this exact same way.
Because domestic violence is one of those ACEs. Because even Candace is perfectly right. Even if it's not directly happening to that kid, if you see your dad beating your mom, that's going to be sticking in there. That's going to change that brain. That's an adversity.
Even emotional and verbal abuse.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there are 5 different types of abuses that they talk about in the ACE study. Oh, yeah. So our kids, when they're coming to us who are living in toxic stress and states of adversity, they're really coming to us here. They're not entering our classrooms at their social engagement. They're not entering ready to learn. They're starting out here. We got to help them get back down here. So the children who are chronically monitoring for cues of danger in the classroom are frequently the same kids who have difficulties learning and the same kids who you see in the office in trouble all the time. We try to use the laws of ramping up motivation through punishment or changing or like giving them rewards based on their behaviors. That doesn't work because these are not normal behaviors. These are atypical behaviors that could be normal in the life they're living in. So when we try to say, oh, you're going to be punished if you do that, oh, you'll get a reward if you do that, students of trauma, the adversities they experience and are so unable to control, they don't think that their behaviors and actions actually matter. Because it's just whatever's going to happen to them is whatever the adults say it's going to be. So when they are living in these survival states, it leads to maladaptive coping strategies like drugs, alcohol, food, overworking, and sex, just to try and bring that temporary relief. And just like the neurons in our brains can be changed through neuroplasticity, the vagus nerve can be retrained through experiences of co-regulation and safe connection, which is why it is so important for relationships with our kids. That's the number one thing, is just relationships. Like, I mean, you guys know I work a lot with attendance, and one thing we say is, well, attendance is not going to change if you're punishing the kid or giving them rewards for coming. The attendance is only going to change when they start to have a relationship with their school and they start to have connections. Everything in education boils down to relationships and connection. Here is another version of the polyvagal theory, but this one's as a ladder. Does anyone have any clue of why it might be a ladder? Escalates. Oh, I like that. I haven't even heard that one yet. So you can't get from your ventral vagal straight to your dorsal vagal. And you can't get from your dorsal vagal right back to ventral. You have to go through the stages. So when a kid's shut down, you're not going to immediately get them to comply. I would rather have a kid say F you than immediately just comply, because then I know something's off. But when a kid says F you, they're going back through that sympathetic activation. So they're coming back down. So students who are in their ventral vagal, we often see a feelings of safety, security, and just feeling good. They're able to connect and co-regulate. This is where they can have healthy relationships. Just all around the bee's knees. It's a safe space. And when our students are in fight-flight, some characteristics we might see in that are fighting, aggression, defiance, running and hiding, substance abuse, being defensive, lacking control, and bullying. Versus when we see kids who are in their dorsal vagal, their freeze, they are experiencing behavioral shutdown. They're disassociating from their bodies. They feel numb and are often going to withdraw and have somatic complaints, which means that what's going on in their brain is actually making their bodies hurt. Like, I know we have tons of kids who, they had a stomach ache. I have a stomach ache. I have to go to the nurse. I'm going to throw up. I have to go to the nurse. No, you're just really, really anxious. We just need to regulate you. We need to teach you how to see that that feeling is actually, wow, I'm just really stressed. I need to learn how to regulate. Which is one thing that the polyvagal theory really stresses, is that connection between the mind and the body and learning to listen to that body. Because in our Western culture, we're typically told to just ignore what your body's telling you and just go with like what you think is rational. Pay attention to your gut feelings, because that gut instinct you have, that's your vagus nerve. That is your vagus nerve making you feel, wow, something is wrong. Something is not okay. What's not okay right now? So that's why it is so important to teach listening to your body, connecting that with what we're thinking. So thank you so much for this part of the part one.